The leaked transcript of a North Korean POW who was captured in Ukraine is pretty wild. Just how ill-prepared were these North Korean troops, and why is this actually part of the regime's strategy? Plus, we're going to talk about Putin signaling his readiness to begin peace negotiations. All Ukraine, of course, has to do is surrender first, and Trump's likelihood of being able to reach any kind of deal with Vladimir Putin. And, of course, we're also going to discuss Ukraine counterattacking in Kursk and more Trump crypto grifting. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. And, of course, guys, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button if you appreciate my stances here. You guys know that I'm not exactly in the business of making fans, given that I dunked pretty hard on the Biden White House, and guess what? I'm not going to have anything great to say about the Trump White House either. Maybe at some point we'll actually get real leadership in this country, but for now, we're just going to have to talk about it on the internet. Okay, so Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky released yet today footage of an interrogation of a North Korean soldier captured by the Ukrainian military. This is extremely rare because of the around 10 to 12,000 North Koreans fighting in Kursk. Only 2 have been captured alive, and 3 have been captured alive, one of which died of his wounds shortly after capture. And this reflects a North Korean commitment to not allow their troops to fall into enemy hands, right? Now, these wounded troops were provided with medical attention, and in this video are actually interrogated by the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, here's the transcript. We can't watch the video. YouTube is pretty strict about this kind of thing, but this is the full conversation that he holds with the translator. The interrogator asked if he had any training in Russian weapons and military equipment. He said while some soldiers from his North Korean detachment were trained to use Russian, what he calls heavy equipment, so likely larger weapon systems, probably crew-served weapons and the like, he says, I personally did not undergo such training. But bear in mind, guys, the North Korean standard issue equipment is generally Soviet-era equipment. So it sometimes has some variances, but chances are, if you use that equipment, you could very quickly orient yourself to standard Russian equipment. That includes AK-12s, RPKs, Dragunov sniper rifles. All of those are going to feel very familiar to a North Korean soldier, at least on the individual equipment level. As the equipment gets more advanced, right, Russia has more modern stuff. Again, I don't think North Korea has robust electronic warfare capabilities, whereas the Russians do. But the Russians probably didn't bring the North Koreans in to handle heavy specialty equipment, right? That's not worth it. Instead, they are fulfilling the most high attrition combat tasks, which is infantry unit. He says he worked in a reconnaissance battalion, but here's what's also interesting. He said that he was transported on a ship from North Korea to Russia, which is interesting because North Korea and Russia, while they don't share a land border, they very nearly do, right? The North Korea actually borders China, but you can see here from our friends at Google Maps that it's really easy for them to just hop over. Actually, no, I'm sorry. They do share a very small border right here. So they share a land border, but they deemed it better to actually send the North Koreans over via ship, which is fascinating to me because, again, he says it was a Russian ferry, but not a military vessel, just one for transporting cargo. He says there was only people on board, right? And he says they moved from a ferry to a train, and then there were beds in the carriage, but only about 6 beds for 100 people. Now, the reason I think this is, and he says it was the same group in one car to one ferry to one car. So what seems to have happened is possibly a ferry took them to a train station in Vladivostok. This may have been something that the North Koreans themselves asked for. They said, listen, North Koreans limiting access to information about the outside world is really important. And part of the idea here that North Korea seems to be operating under is this idea that any one soldier should possess the absolute minimum amount of information about in the event of their capture, right? And so they likely said, listen, we don't want them to get a sense of the scale of the operation. So we only want these groups of 100 to be transported together and not see other groups, right? That would, of course, mean that if this person, right, he's captured, they say, oh, well, how many people were in the whole detachment? He goes, well, I've never seen the whole detachment. So I can't tell you if there is an entire battalion, an entire brigade, an entire division. I don't know. I never saw more than my group of 100 people. You also, being in a ferry, particularly in the belly of a ferry, means that he may only have a sense of a little bit of the length of time of his journey, but not be able to actually recreate it the way you could if you say were crossing via a land border, right? He might then be able to say, oh, here's what the border looks like. Here's when we crossed. Here's the towns and villages that we passed through. Instead, he may have been kept in isolation to avoid him gaining any kind of insight into the North Korean border operations. And so once he was there, of course, he reports that he joined the military being conscripted at 17 years old. This is very standard. In North Korea, they have a mandatory military service of, I think, 10 to 15 years. So most men beginning service at 17 and ending, I think, around the time they turn 30. The Ukrainian asks about serving as a contract or conscript soldier. This is a distinction that's really important in Russian soldiers. Generally, contract soldiers are higher paid. There are technically no conscripts, but as a general rule, certain classes of contract soldier are going to be of a higher caliber. They're going to be in specialty roles, whereas a mobnik or a mobilized soldier is going to be more likely to be in a infantry role with less experience and less specialty skills. Now, one of the things he says is the soldier says, I didn't know before coming to Russia that I would be fighting in Ukraine. He says, in Russia, I didn't even know who we were fighting against, right? So he says, I don't know anything about casualties at all. He goes, I was there alone starting from the battle on January 3rd, and it's hard to answer about large-scale numbers, likely because, again, he's never seen anything to give him an indication of the scale of the North Korean deployment, right? He says, what do you know about the world outside of North Korea? POW says, not much. What do you know about South Korea? He says, I only know that South Korea has fewer mountains than North Korea. And this is really interesting, again, that this is someone who claims to have access to very little knowledge about the outside world. And it's an indicator that, North Korea at the state propaganda level actually says a lot of things about South Korea. They say that they are puppets of the United States, that the U.S. imperialism is surrounding them on all sides, eager to chomp down on them. They describe China as a friend of sorts. But this is at the state level, right? For the individual conscript entering the military at 17, who doesn't have access to likely any kind of official sources of information, he simply doesn't know anything. And this may not be a function of like resisting interrogation. This may literally be seen as a national security priority to ensure that North Korea's soldiers don't have great insight into the larger system. They may simply be meant to be as atomized as possible, and so that in the event of this sort of capture of a soldier, that there's not that much information that can get out about reality. Of course, it's hard to know how much is him trying to offer very little information, right? Claiming to know nothing and be a low-level private, and how much is literally him actually being a low-level private. But the fact is that the North Koreans seem to have instituted a policy that no one gets captured, including soldiers eliminating their wounded, and allegedly even North Korean soldiers self-eliminating. That's the only way I can phrase it, thanks to YouTube. Okay. I'm going to keep you guys updated as more comes out about these North Koreans that have been captured. And, this is probably one of the first times that we've seen video of a captured North Korean a soldier, at least. Certainly a soldier serving on essentially active duty in the North Korean army. But what I wanted to also, before we talk about Vladimir Putin congratulating President Trump for winning the election and discussing his own version of the peace plan, I want to mention that if you are looking to get your fitness back under your belt, so to speak, here in 2025, or maybe your goals are to do more at work or just be a little more focused and locked in, as the kids say, I have just the solution. StrikeGum, 90 milligrams caffeine in each piece, 100 milligrams alpha GPC. This pack contains the equivalent of 5 energy drinks worth of caffeine. So if you're looking for the better zero sugar caffeine solution that's veteran owned and made in the USA, right down in Denver, you want to get your StrikeGum. Go over to strikegum.com or just go to Amazon, search for StrikeGum. The link to both are in the description. Okay. Vladimir Putin has congratulated President Trump on his upcoming inauguration and says, I'm ready for dialogue, right? But he says, first off, we have to address the root causes of the crisis. Now, remember, guys, it's only in the United States and the English language media that people go, oh, Putin felt like he was surrounded by NATO, which I, again, encourage those of you that say that to look at a map, okay? So when you get these bros that are like, oh, Putin was surrounded, it seems weird because obviously North Korea, not a NATO country. China, not a NATO country. Mongolia, not a NATO country. Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, all of which are not NATO countries. Azerbaijan, Georgia, not NATO countries. Ukraine, not a NATO country. Belarus, not a NATO country. Moldova, not a NATO country. So a fascinating fact that for a country that feels it's surrounded by NATO countries, something like 80 to 90% of Russia's border is not NATO. And Putin himself has never said that the root cause of this conflict was NATO. Again, he was asked about it by Tucker Carlson in an interview. And Putin said, no, this is the root cause of this conflict is that Russia believes that Ukraine is a part of Russia. And so this is when he says we have to address the root causes of the conflict. The root cause is Ukraine doing this pesky thing existing that is offensive to Putin, right? So he'll say, listen, we can address the root cause of the conflict, which is the independent Ukraine. And he says a good start to this, a good start to negotiations, guys, not the end state. The start would be for Ukraine to simply withdraw from Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. This is, again, and remember, this would be for Putin a condition to start negotiations. So essentially all he says is, yeah, I'll be happy to talk with you guys. Just let me move the ball from like currently where we're at, like the 50-yard line. Let me move it to the 20-yard line, and then let's talk. That is obviously a scam, right? Just like to say, just like if you were playing football and the other team was to say that, like, hey, why don't listen? In the interest of showing your good faith to play a competitive game and reach a solidly agreed upon conclusion, why don't you show me as an act of good faith? Let me start on the 20-yard line, and then we'll negotiate. Well, that's absurd because you're going to, of course, it's obvious that once they're at the 20-yard line, they're just going to play more football. They're going to just get a touchdown, right? And so that's what Putin is proposing here. And he's shown that that's his MO because remember, Putin also invaded Crimea in 2014, the Donbass, violated no less than 3 different Minsk Accords. And so to sit there and say, oh, well, this time he's definitely going to be sincere. He's definitely going to be honest about it. It's absurd, right? The only, again, possible way, which is something that Putin has said he'll never do, right, is one, I don't think Ukraine is going to withdraw from territory that Russia doesn't control. But if they were to surrender territory, they would need, they've said, a guarantee, which would mean either NATO membership, right, of the remainder of Ukraine, or a literal skin in the game peacekeeping force, which would be extremely expensive for the United States, which is the only country that would be doing something like that. So this is, of course, just more Putinist bullshit. And it's pretty clear that that Trump is just not equipped for this, right? His so-called envoy, Keith Kellogg, who also had a proposal deal that like despite being a 3-star general, and this is one of those things that like really bothers me about the US military, is that they don't actually select for guys that are that smart. They select for guys that have the most risk-free career. Why? Because in the US military, one, everything is so prescribed in how military operations go that the chances for stunning success are just non-existent, right? Can you name a general who had who was exceptionally talented in Iraq or Afghanistan, whose abilities and command really created decisive wins in a way that other people couldn't? No, you can't. Why? Because one, we lost the whole war. All the metrics we used to try to determine if we were winning or not were total bullshit. And so you end up with this generation of generals who are in charge who don't understand anything, right? They're clueless. They existed by simply not fucking up, by not fucking up too bad, which you ensure that by never taking any kind of meaningful risk. And so Keith Kellogg's proposal has huge holes in it that disincentivize negotiating in the first place. And even he himself has said that while initially Trump said, we're going to end the war within 24. Initially, Trump said that he's going to end the war before he takes office, which insanely enough, him and the Biden administration somehow managed to coordinate and actually end the Gaza conflict, insane as that may be, before taking office. Which, again, credit where credit's due. Both of them somehow combined to actually reach this deal. And we saw the Gaza hostages released yesterday. We saw some of the footage released of their families, which, like, you can't be mad about that. You can't hate, like, one, where there was fighting, there is no longer fighting, where there was innocent people whose only crime was existing, being held hostage, seeing them return to their families. That's, like, good. That's just a good thing. But Trump claimed Trump never claimed he was going to solve the Gaza conflict before taking office, but he seems to have at least contributed to it, in part by his rhetoric and creating, again, as we've talked about, that sense among the parties that their best window for negotiation is actively closing. Kellogg has actually said, well, actually, no, we're not going to get this thing done before Trump takes office or the first 24 hours of Trump taking office. It's actually going to be within the first 100 days. And that is probably, based on current trends, going to slip even further, right? How do I know this? Because Polymarket has actually assessed, will Trump end the Ukraine war in his first 90 days of taking office? And at its peak, people thought there was actually a 53% chance he would do it. This is right leading up to the election. And then now, as more parties have come out, you saw that hovered around 46, 47%, but now it's actually plummeted to as low as 28% and is sitting at just about 36, 37% chance. So the odds of this happening in the first 90 days are basically not nil, but they're very little. And I think that is reflective of, as we've talked about, the Trump administration, right, which, again, has unfortunately seemed to prioritize grifting, at least so far, grifting and backpedaling on their promises, instead of actually engaging in meaningful governance and certainly not meaningful international collaboration and cooperation. We're not really seeing, the odds of this event of an actual peace deal being reached are diminishing very fast. And one of the things that isn't diminishing very fast, though, is, again, Russia continues its policy of just incrementally making tiny, tiny, tiny little gains that take months and months possibly to achieve anything. Look no further than Pokrovsk, a town that Russia believed it was mere weeks away from seizing, as of about, let's take it back to like September of 2024. You can see here they were like, Russia's like, guys, Pokrovsk is going to fall. We are going to be taking Pokrovsk. Watch out. And then just a brisk 5 months later, and Pokrovsk still standing, right? Russia has, though, seized some valuable open fields outside Pokrovsk. And don't get me wrong, like, with enough time, they will encircle the town. But boy, they are really buying this on the installment plan. And what's more important, I think, is that Ukraine, despite the fact that there's been a lot of hand-wringing about Ukraine lacking the manpower to defend itself, seems to be actually counterattacking. You can see them here, counterattacking and retaking territory at Makhnova. Again, while the Russian and North Korean forces have pushed the Ukrainian salient back in Kursk by about 60%, you are seeing, again, these small-scale counterattacks, which indicates, again, here's another example here near Zelenivka, just small counterattacks, local, likely to achieve specific tactical advantages, but it's a sign that the Ukrainians actually are not experiencing quite the manpower crisis that I think the Russians want us to believe that they're experiencing. And don't get me wrong, like, the Ukrainians definitely are having recruitment issues. There's no doubt about it. But I think reports of their inevitable collapse have been greatly exaggerated. Now, the other problem with Trump negotiating a peace deal is that Trump isn't actually a party to the war. You might recall that the war is actually between Ukraine and Russia. And the other entity that gets a say in this is actually Europe, right? And Europe has a very different stance on the war, right? Namely, that Russia is rearming faster than anyone thought possible, right? And this is according to a German general who says Russian forces are actually able to grow, in some ways, their conventional military capacity, right? And particularly, he's describing its ability to build tanks, missiles, and drones, right? Now, obviously, Russia has a pretty good sustainment system for its tanks or its drones. Its missiles, of course, it's going to continue to manufacture, likely from North Korea, as well as Iran. And its tanks, though, what I think is interesting is that there's a lot of hand-wringing about tanks, but we've seen that actually the Russian use of armor has basically diminished to nothing. So it makes sense, of course, that the Russians are refurbishing and restocking tanks because they're not really all that relevant on the battlefield. And the German general said, quote, "It's not clear that Putin had any specific plans to attack NATO countries. He was clearly creating conditions for it," right? What this means is, one of the things we've talked about is that the Russian war economy, their whole country has pivoted to a war economy footing. And in some ways, that has been bad. It's spiked inflation. Obviously, it's killed a lot of Russians. But one of the things that we've talked about is that for the Russian state, actually, because their conscripts are so old, they are actually extremely economically beneficial for Russia to kill them off. Because unlike if you kill an 18-year-old, right, what happens? That 18-year-old never gets married and has kids, exacerbating Russia's demographic crisis. He never works and pays taxes, which an 18-year-old should be doing for, about 50 years. And so you end up taking this massive economic loss by killing an 18-year-old. But thanks to the dronification of warfare and the high-tech nature of warfare, it's less physically capable men, particularly men over 50, are more likely to be drafted or are mobilized into this war. And those men have already had all the kids they're going to have. The Russian life expectancy for a man is about 65. So if you're 50, you've had probably about 85% of your working life. Remember, the alcohol-related illnesses are one of the leading causes of death in Russia. So, and if you've ever seen someone die of alcoholism or cirrhosis or an alcohol-related cancer, it's a slow, painful process that takes several years. So those at about 50 or 55, you're going to start to see Russian men demographically go from being a net contributor to the tax base to being a draw on the tax base. So killing them off in a conflict is actually helping Russia out a lot. So what you have is this incentive for the Russian economy to actually keep doing war shit. And again, it's not clear that Putin will actually go ahead and try to seize NATO countries, right? But he may end up miscalculating. That's sort of the fear. I think what his fear would be is if, he looks at the Trump administration, he looks at even the Biden administration, he says, man, they've been so unwilling. They've become increasingly unwilling to aid Ukraine. He goes, they're doing it not because politically they lack the will. He says they're no longer able to. They don't have the artillery shells. They don't have the drones. They don't have the tanks. They don't have the equipment. And so he'll say, we've actually bled NATO dry in this conflict. And so the fear is that Putin's going to look and calculate and say, yeah, I think we can actually take NATO. And the scary thing is he may be right, because today, if the U.S. Army had to fight today in Ukraine, they would have no ability to stop the drones. None. Nothing. Zero. They have some drone jammers. But again, a fiber optic drone, something that Russia has scaled up its production, and is the cost of both Ukrainian and Russian fiber optic drones is diminishing massively. That ability, the U.S. military can't counter. And so what you end up with is, again, in all likelihood, a U.S. And a NATO military that may not actually be able to resist Russia in its modern tactics. Now, obviously, what Russia lacks, it makes trade-offs, right? In exchange for this dronification of warfare, they simply cannot make lightning gains, but they may feel they don't need to. So one of the things that I also wanted to discuss here that I think is important is what Trump's been doing, right? Instead of, running the country, is that he has ramped up day one with some really big day one policies. But first, he's got to grift everybody for crypto. That's right, Trump coin. Now, I want to point out my concerns here. We've discussed earlier Trump coin, but apparently, Trump coins launched so successful, turning Trump into a multi-billionaire, that Melania said, I want the official Melania. Now, here's what's interesting. They call it a meme. They're like the official Trump meme, the official Melania meme. Why don't they call it a coin? Well, likely for legal reasons. Though, again, the president cannot commit a crime. The Supreme Court ruled this. So why he needs to even pretend to comply with a law, given the law doesn't apply to the president. The Supreme Court has said this. Why he even needs to not call it a coin. He can call it the official currency of the United States. Who's going to sue him? Nobody. And so Melania has launched her meme coin or whatever, and now has a market cap, get this, guys, buckle up, of nearly $2 billion. So Melania just became a billionaire. Trump adding $50 billion to his net worth. In fact, he's generally believed to have about $2 billion in existing assets. He has another $3 to $5 billion in his stock, which is just True Social, DJT or whatever. And now he has $55 billion in assets in his crypto. And as we've pointed out, this exists solely as a vehicle to funnel money, from his supporters to him and Melania, but also for foreign entities, governments. Remember, there's no know your customer laws in the crypto space. Any wallet could be attributed to anybody, and it's really hard to figure out who are behind some of these wallets. So in all likelihood, if Vladimir Putin wants to simply bribe Trump to abandon Ukraine, he may simply just buy a bunch of fucking Trump coin and be like, listen, I'm going to keep the price at a level that you like. And if you don't like it, I'm going to tank your cryptocurrency and in the process, tank your net worth. And of course, though, Trump is out here, savvy investor that he is actually trying to very slowly liquidate his Trump coin holdings into ETH. He sold literally 16 million, then another 42 million into ETH, all with Trump-controlled wallets. Which is fascinating. But again, bear in mind that at the current rate, if you're talking about 42 million in 8 hours, Trump needs a mere 6 months to liquidate all of his shitty meme coin and turn it into ETH, which again is also worthless electronic money. But again, remember, this is the same man who is in charge of the SEC. So if you think it's a problem that the man responsible for regulating crypto holds a bunch of crypto in all sorts of Solana and Ethereum chains, it's a problem. Just like it was a problem. Remember that President Biden's son sat on the board of a bunch of gas companies, did a bunch of big business deals with Chinese businesses, and people were like, damn, this is a conflict of interest, right? Even if it's not clear that it actually resulted in policy changes, it's just a bad conflict of interest. So if you believe that, then you also have to believe that a president holding cryptocurrencies in specific cryptocurrencies that he is responsible for regulating ultimately, that's also a conflict of interest. Welcome to the real world, dude. It's all one big club and we aren't in it. Anyway, I appreciate you guys that support me. I'm never going to sell you a crypto scam. I'm just going to tell you, you get access to uncensored combat footage over on combatvetnews.com. And you members that help me out, like Bill Collier, Robert Colburn, Gaius Martin, Gina Quester, Chris Gorsuch, Francis Karius, L90, Petra Taruru. You guys are all the ones who make this whole thing possible. You give me the power to say what I want and not become some sort of turbo political grifter because you guys have my back. Thank you. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.